أنه قال: إذا رأيت الرجل يأتي الطاعة فاعلم أن له عنده منها أخوات، وإذا رأيت الرجل يأتي المعصية فاعلم أن له عنده منها أخوات، فإن الطاعة تدل على أختها والمعصية تدل على أختها. هذا كلام في غاية من النفاسة، هذا الكلام في غاية من النفاسة والمتانة والجودة والقوة، كأنه يعطيك مرآة لترى بها نفسك. يقول: إذا رأيت الرجل، وهذا عام للرجال والنساء، وذكر الرجل تغليبا. إذا رأيت الرجل يأتي الطاعة، يعني يفعل الطاعة وراء الطاعة، فاعلم أن له عنده منها أخوات في الخفاء، من الخوف من الجليل جل جلاله والتقرب إليه جل وعز بأنواع القرب. وإذا رأيت الرجل يأتي المعصية فاعلم أن له عنده منها أخوات، إذا خلا بمحارم الله انتهكها والعياذ بالله. فإن الطاعة تدل على أختها، لأن الطاعة تدل وتحثك على الاستزادة. أنت تريد أن تطبق قول الله جل وعلا: وسارعوا إلى مغفرة، وسابقوا إلى مغفرة من ربكم، وسارعوا إلى جنة عرضها السماوات والأرض، إلى غير ذلك. تريد أن تسارع. والمعصية إذا ما وقعت سول لك الشيطان وحسن، فدلك على أخرى، فجرك إلى ثالثة، فإلى رابعة. فالمرء يتجاذب ثلاثة أمور: الذي يسقط في الشر والمعاصي والعياذ بالله، الهوى، النفس الأمارة بالسوء، والشيطان. هؤلاء الثلاثة كلهم يدعونك والعياذ بالله إلى ترك الصراط المستقيم. وهناك داعي الرحمن، وهي النفس اللوامة، وملائكة الله جل وعز ووحيه ونذير ذلك في كتابه عز وجل وفي سنة رسوله عليه الصلاة والسلام. إذا ضعف عندك الاستجابة لنداء الرحمن أقبلت إلى نداء الشيطان، وإذا ضعف عندك استجابة لنداء الشيطان قربت إلى نداء الرحمن. وعلى هذا يكون الإنسان يسير بين هذين لا ثالث لهما. نعم.
Shaykh Abdullaah Ta'ala went on to mention, he says, for what reason am I reminding you today about this, about taking advantage of thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for these favors and for these blessings? He says this is because today you have good health. The people are in well-being and they have good health. He says, as for tomorrow, there could be sickness, and there could be the opposite of this, and you don't know what might happen tomorrow. And to the point that he said, the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, he pointed this out in the authentic hadith in which he stated, take advantage of 5 things before 5 things. Take advantage of 5 things before 5 things. And from these 5 things is taking advantage of your life before your death. Taking advantage of your life before your death. And taking advantage of your free time before you become busy and preoccupied. And taking advantage of your good health before the time of sickness and bad health comes. Or as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. He says, so therefore you must rush forth and hasten to taking advantage of these opportunities. And you must rush forth and hasten to acting upon the ta'ah, the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to the point, the Shaykh Abdullaah Ta'ala, he says that Imam Ibn Abi Shaybah rahimahullah ta'ala, he collected a narration on the authority of Urwa ibn az-Zubayr, in which he says, radiallahu anhu, he says, this author is translated to mean, if you see a man going to the act of obedience, going to the ta'ah, then know for sure know for sure that this act of obedience, it has sisters. It has sisters. If you see a man performing the ta'ah, then know for sure it has sisters. And he says, but if you see a man performing acts of disobedience and disobeying Allah Azza wa Jalla, then know these acts of disobedience, they have sisters. They have sisters. He says this means that there are other acts of obedience that will follow and come as a consequence, or as a fruit rather, for this act of obedience. And similarly the acts of disobedience. He says this athar, this narration, is extremely precious and extremely valuable and extremely strong. It's a great statement. And it is as if you can look at yourself through a mirror. It is as if you can look at yourself through a mirror with this athar. He says this is general for the men and for the women. But he mentioned the rijal for taghlib in most cases, men. But it's general for men and women. He says that when you see him performing acts of worship and obeying Allah Azza wa Jal, then know that there are sister acts of worship that's going to come. And when it's hidden, when no one can see him, and he fears Allah Al-Jalil, the Sublime subhanahu wa ta'ala, in secret, and he fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in private. And he says, and there are all types of acts of worship and all types of means of closeness that he'll perform seeking Allah Azza wa Jal's pleasure because of the first act of obedience that he performed. And he says, similarly is the opposite, وَعَلِيَذَ بِاللَّهِ, the ma'siyah, the one who performs the acts of disobedience. They have sister acts of disobedience. And you'll find him when he's alone and when he's by himself, he unveils the sacred things that Allah Azza wa Jalla has made. The sacred things, the impermissible things. He goes and he performs them, وَعَلِيَذَ بِاللَّهِ. He says this because the ta'ah, it points a person to more ta'ah. The obedience, it points a person to more obedience. And similarly, the disobedience, it points a person to acts of other disobedience. And the Shaykh Abdullaah Ta'ala, he mentioned that Allah Azza wa Jalla, he tells us in the Quran, وَسَارِعُوا, to rush forth, وَسَابِقُوا, to hasten, to compete with one another, and acts of good, and acts of obedience. And to rush forth to the paradise, whose its vastness is that of the heavens and the earth. The different ayat in the Quran commanding us to rush forth and hasten to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's obedience and to the Jannah, to the paradise. And he says here that when a person performs disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he falls into three different things, or there are three different problems that are a result of this, or three different things that he's responded to. He says the first is, he says here, is shaitan. He says here, afwan, he says the shaitan, it causes a person to fall into the disobedience, and then it brings another act of disobedience, and then a third act of disobedience, and then a fourth act of disobedience, and so on and so forth. And it continues to pile up. The sins, they continue to pile up. He says, so therefore when a person falls into an act of disobedience, then there are three things, three problems that he falls into, for lack of better translation. He says, firstly is, he falls into hawa, following his lusts and his whims and his vain desires. And secondly, he falls into the soul that commands with evil. A nafs, ammara bis-su, the soul that commands him and orders him with evil and orders him to do bad. And the third is the shaitan, is the devil, wal-iyadhu billah. And these things, they call him and they invite him to abandon the straight path and to leave off the sirat al-mustaqim, wal-iyadhu billah. And he says in the exact opposite, when a person goes to the obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then he answers the call of Ar-Rahman, or the caller of Ar-Rahman, the da'i of Ar-Rahman, the inviter of Ar-Rahman. And similarly the angels, and the text of the book and the sunnah. And the soul that is lawama, the blameworthy soul. The soul that's blameworthy. It has some bad and it has some good, but it still calls him to that which is good. He says, so therefore, whenever you become weak in answering the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you will incline to the shaitan and to the evil soul and into your lust and your desires. And whenever your call in response to shaitan becomes weak, then you'll incline towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and answering the call of Ar-Rahman, and then you will travel unto paradise. You'll travel unto the Jannah.
فالمؤمن الحصيف العاقل يجب عليه أن يتذكر أن هذه الحياة أيام أو ليال وساعات أو سويعات وتنقضي. كما قال الإمام ابن القيم رحمه الله: حقيقة الدنيا هي وقت بين وقتين. حقيقة الدنيا هي وقت بين وقتين.